Hey, hey, and welcome. We are talking today about the sandpaper letters. Sandpaper letters that Maria Montessori created and used for her early classrooms offered children a way to learn how to read and write in a way that was almost magical, that she could not stop writing about or teaching about because the experience was tactile and it really revolutionized the way we teach children how to read and write in early education today.
That's right.
And science backs this. Hands-on education is a known, proven thing now, and it is an essential part of early childhood education. And guess what, friends? You can use this technique at home with your children too to teach your children how to read and write with or without a set of sandpaper letters. And we're going to show you the sandpaper letters, and we're going to talk about how to use this in your home, and we'll give you alternatives if you don't have a set. So welcome everyone to Montessori 101. This is a series by Child of the Redwoods, all about the magic of Montessori. We believe that every child deserves a Montessori education at home. So I'm Aubrey Hargis.
And I'm David Hargis. And today, as Aubrey was saying, we're going to talk about the sandpaper letters. It's another in our installment of essential Montessori materials. We're going through 21 of our favorites over the next several months. And if you're interested in the full list, or you just would like a hands-on guide, you can get that on our website at childoftheredwoods.com. If you go to childoftheredwoods.com/free, scroll down and you'll find those 21 essential Montessori items, including sandpaper letters.
Yes. Now, this episode is being recorded live on YouTube. For those of you who are watching live, jump in with your question about sandpaper letters if you have them. We'd be happy to answer anything at the end of our talk. And if you're listening to the podcast, then you're hearing the recording of us live on YouTube. And you're welcome to come and join us live anytime.
Absolutely.
But you can always catch the recording later on the podcast. Now, let's start. What are sandpaper letters? So let me just show you guys some sandpaper letters. These are actually some sandpaper letters that are produced by a Montessori materials company. So if you're wondering what the classic Montessori material looked like, now we didn't have this set when our children were little. We used DIY sets. We'll talk about that later on. But this is basically what you're looking at here. This is a cursive letter S. I don't know if it's showing up right on YouTube or if it's showing up backwards. You can see this is a cursive letter R. And I'll show you some vowels too. Here we have an O. Okay. So you can see how it starts here on my side, and then you go up and around and over. Okay. And then here is the letter I. All right. And here is a G. You'll notice that this one is quite a bit bigger. Why? Because we're teaching children. Well, I'll go into that later. But
don't give it away yet.
You can think of like if you're writing on a line, right? The top of your G is going to be here, and what's underneath this loop right here. So this is just bigger. And then here is an M. Okay, and it's kind of big this way horizontally because it takes a lot of space to write an M, a lot more space than it would take to write an O. And the size of the board demonstrates that. So what is a sandpaper letter? It is basically a board or a thick piece of paper, cardboard, that with a letter written in on it, one for every single letter of the entire alphabet in English. And if you're speaking another language, you would make it for whatever letters or characters you're teaching your child in your language. But Maria spoke Italian, so she had one for every single phonetic letter used in Italian. The letter itself has a tactile feel to it. So they are called sandpaper letters, and it is made with sand or maybe even sandpaper. I can't tell if this is made with actual sandpaper or if it's just somehow the sand has been pressed on. But it's really lovely. It's not a rough sandpaper experience. It's very, very light to the touch, but you can definitely feel, if you kind of close your eyes, you can definitely feel the smoothness of the board. And then you can feel when there is a change in texture with your fingers on the board itself. So that's all it is. The consonants, you'll notice, like the letter M is a consonant and it is on pink. And the vowels happen to be on blue. friends, the color is not important. But we like to contrast the vowels and the consonants in Montessori because it just helps the children to make the distinction between them. Makes it also really obvious when we're working with them in words, because we will use the sandpaper letters in a variety of ways
That's right.
that lead us up into word building.
And I
Okay.
believe these colors do match to the movable alphabet, right?
They do.
So there
They
is
do.
consistency there as well.
Yeah. So whatever, if you're using a movable alphabet, you'll probably notice that your consonants are also in pink or red,
Mhm.
and your vowels are going to be in blue. But in other educational materials, you might see this reverse. So if you're shopping at a traditional store like Lakeshore, you might see the vowels in red and the consonants in blue. It doesn't really matter as long as you're trying to be consistent with your kids. But that is really all they are. They're just some letters that have tactile feel on individual cards.
Yeah,
or
it's
boards.
something, it's really that, like to boil it down, it's basically two different textures. In this case, a hard, smooth, and then a rougher, hard. And you can really feel the edges. Is that
You
tactile
can,
experience?
but not too rough.
No,
No.
it's not like an emery board or like a really rough sandpaper.
Right.
It's subtle.
So if you were
right?
going to make this at home, you would want to use your finest, like a really fine sandpaper, because little children do have very sensitive fingers. And if the sandpaper is too rough, sometimes they will say that it hurts their fingers.
And you do want them also to be really thinking about the sensorial experience. So in some ways, making it more subtle really draws their attention to it.
It does.
And
It's an asset.
trying to feel to it. Yeah. I think it's great, and you talked about that a minute ago. I love that with these materials, what makes them so clever, here's the G, for example. I love that idea. Like, why would the G be placed like this versus the M? And it's because we're imagining drawing on a blank line, or a line, a horizontal line that goes across. And we're imagining where the placement of those letters might be on that line. And where the space is above or below it is indicating it without actually literally having the line.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and go further. I brought also a B here in cursive, and it doesn't matter. You can have these in print or in cursive, either one, whatever you are working with your child. But you can see, I'm going to go ahead and just place the cursive B and the G next to each other. You can see, you can just see the shapes of them and how it just really illustrates how tall they are. Right?
But you wouldn't if you're thinking, you wouldn't draw your line here, right?
No.
So it's a clever way. It's built into the material itself, the sense of, well, this is actually where you would draw without making it without highlighting it. So there's something really clever within the materials themselves. They're very simple, but they're genius.
They are. So when we had a DIY set of sandpaper letters at home, I will just let you know that they were all the same shape and the same size, about the size of this one, actually. It just had a little vertical, and I had just made my little sandpaper letters just right here on this shape. So you don't have to make them super specific and fancy, but if you are a Montessori materials company, you might as well go all the way.
Totally.
And make them as detailed as you can.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, let's talk about the history a little bit.
Yeah.
How did she come about? Well, these are one of her earlier, as I understand, it's one of her earlier discoveries. She talks about in one of her books in the Montessori Method, she just talks about having, lectured on it as in the 19th century, as early as 1899. It was critical. Her discovery of how children read and write and materials to help support that was one of her greatest breakthroughs, when she has that kind of aha moment where the children seem to be spontaneously learning to read and write. It's a really wonderful story. So it's a critical part of her experience. And as we'll talk about it in a little bit, it's actually, as she talks about in other places, it's not the material itself, it's this sensorial experience. So what is going on here, right? Basically, we're talking about a tactile experience, right? So we talked about, there could be an invisible line and this is pink or blue. That's actually not what's important, right? What she discovered was children in that first plane, who are in the sensorial plane, they're taking in the world in a sensorial way, right? If they're in the first plane. And so helping them to connect what's fairly abstract, like a letter, which symbolizes some kind of a sound, in a more concrete way, was brilliant. And the idea is that if you feel the smooth part and then you go to the rough part, you're really going to kind of start to make those connections. So this is what she actually says. She says, tracing the letter in the fashion of writing begins the muscular education which prepares for writing. The child who looks, recognizes, and touches the letter in the manner of writing prepares himself simultaneously for reading and writing. Touching the letter and looking at them at the same time fixes the image more quickly through the cooperation of the senses. Later, the two facts separate. Looking becomes reading, touching becomes writing. According to the type of the individual, some learn to read first and others to write. So, in other words, it's just really beginning with this tactile experience.
But while you're doing the feeling, you're also saying the sound.
Because you're starting to then simultaneously connect the dots,
Mhm.
which will then eventually separate, and one will go into the learning, the mastery of reading, and one into the mastery of writing. But at this early stage, what she's trying to say is we want to create a tactile experience
Mhm.
that's associating sound, object, shape, feel, all the ways that we can use a sensorial experience together and start to connect the dots so that when they're ready to take that transition into reading and writing, especially as they get into the second plane where the second plane of abstract thinking, they've got the resources needed in order to make that really happen. So this is something I think you would probably introduce this around the age of 4. It really depends on the readiness of the child. And it's not just that linguistics readiness, because it is so much about the tactile. It's also about physical, a motor skill, gross and a fine motor skill. So in the last couple episodes, we had the pink tower, then we had the picture, and those were some part of what that's about is refining a fine motor skill. And when we talked about the picture, we talked about how this is actually preparation for writing. Well, this is a progression within that, right? So there's learning hand control and minute skill, and then in a different kind of practice, but now making it more concrete to the learning of reading and writing, feeling this letter, tracing it with your finger, and hearing the sound, and then starting to play more and more games with it.
So I'll say that a lot of parents, when they hear about the sandpaper letters, and it is probably the very first material they encounter when thinking about using the Montessori method to teach their children how to read, they usually find the sandpaper letters and they get all excited, and they want to just jump right into that lesson.
Yep.
And so we usually caution parents against that, because before your child has an experience learning how to read and write, visually seeing the letter, recognizing the letter, we want them to have so much experience with developing those fine motor skills, learning the sequence of things. Because if you teach your child a variety of Montessori works in the practical life area, you're going to be teaching them the order of things. So if you can think about a simple hand washing work, may have many, many steps, right? From filling up the pitcher and
Yep.
pouring it into the basin, as we talked about in the last episode,
Carrying it to the
carrying
table.
it to the table, getting your supplies ready, dipping your hands in, and then getting the soap, and then soaping your hands, and then the actual washing. And then what do you do when you have soapy hands? Like, your children have to remember all these little steps. And what this is doing is it's preparing them mentally for the sequence of later skills like math and reading and writing. So before literacy, it needs to come the preparation of that sensitivity, that sensitive period for order really needs to be filled up.
Which is where you would use something like a pink tower, which can help reinforce the idea of order, right? Because the cubes go from larger to smaller as you stack them, right? So these earlier materials, which are so iconic, and they sometimes can feel, I think we often in our culture sort of, we infantilize them, or like, oh, babies play with blocks, and it's true, they are appealing, but I would argue that a lot of adults like to play with blocks too.
Totally.
We call them Legos and things.
Yeah.
But or other crafts. I mean, there's all kinds of things, crafts and activities we do, but they actually have a pedagogical reason, like that Maria and other early researchers discovered. It's preparing, like you said, the idea of mental order, and it's also preparing specific kinds of skills. So the ability to take your finger and trace it very precisely over the shape is going to really aid you as you're trying to think of the sound. And at the end of the day, we call this, it's an M, it's a cursive M, but if we really think about it, it's just a squiggly line. We've given the name an M, and what we're trying to do is get the child to think squiggly line makes a sound in English, and we call it an M, and this is the shape it makes. And all these are progressive steps that don't come instantaneously, but they are building on earlier skills, including learning how to put things in order.
Right. So the concrete sensorial materials in practical life lessons are super critical. And so usually we say we don't teach sandpaper letters until around the age of 4, and this is plus or minus some. But the reason is because we want to make sure children have a really strong grounding in that practical life and sensorial. And so if you go into a Montessori classroom today and you look and you see what the 3-year-olds are doing, chances are, I mean, it could be that you have some 3-year-olds that are doing some sandpaper letters, but chances are they're probably going to be immersed in more of those sequential ordering, sensorial type of activities before, way before they're introduced to something like the sandpaper letters. Another thing that's going on that you want to make sure that you don't miss before you jump into the sandpaper letters is the oral training that we do with children. So in the sensorial area, we, of course, we're training children's ears. If you're brand new to Montessori, there's a classic and wonderful sensorial work called the cylinder, the sound cylinders, where you're actually matching sounds. We also have a set of bells in the Montessori classroom where children are matching pitch. And whether you have these specific activities or not, what you want to make sure your child does is that they are attuning themselves to sounds. They're really listening. They're trying to match sounds, whether they're emulating the sound that the bird makes outside. They're like tweeting to try and reach the same kind of pitch. That would be a sign that your child is developing oral skills, or whether they are hearing the sounds that are around them. And when you're reading a book like Mr. Brown Can Moo, which I remember was one of your favorites with the boys, you are isolating certain elements of the language. So we talk, we go really deep into this in the Homeschool of the Redwoods primary course. This is just like a little summary of that to kind of catch you up to speed for where we are in sandpaper letters. But there are, just to say that there are so many, like there are pages and we have pages and pages of activities that are just about phonological awareness, about preparing the mind, the brain, the ears, for the kind of experience that one would have with these sandpaper letters. Okay, so this isn't something we just jump into first. That being said, it is on our essentials list because it is so important. The concept is so important if you're teaching your child to read. If you have questions about any of that, ask them in the chat. I'd be happy to clarify anything for you guys.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about how you actually give a lesson. Or how Maria Montessori would give a lesson to her children, and kind of what happens today in the classroom too. So Maria Montessori, she actually experimented a lot with these letters. Originally, you talked a little bit about the history, but I think there was even a set of letters and cards in the materials that she learned from Itard.
That's right.
So I think that's the actual origin.
Exactly. I think she was building on.
And I don't think that those were sandpaper. She actually added the sandpaper part.
I believe that's
There was just like a set of cards that she learned from another educator that was like alphabet cards. And then one day, like it occurred to her, we could make this tactical.
Yeah, and I think the version that she originally was using was much more complex in a way, like they were more complex to construct. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but there was some process of discovery where she realized like a simpler approach was actually preferable because it really isolated that down. So her process of development.
She actually got sandpaper out herself and cut out her own little letters and glued them onto the boards.
Yes,
which we can do today.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, if we want to.
That's right. So how would you give this lesson?
Okay, so this lesson actually starts in a really fun, very classically Montessori way. So everyone looks at the sandpaper letters and thinks, okay, so, just tell me how to teach with them. But no, Maria Montessori says, first we have to prepare the fingers. And so she had this little ritual that these children would go through. So before they were allowed to even touch the sandpaper letters at all, they had to go and wash their hands. And so we've mentioned the hand washing activity. And so you can think about the ways that hand washing activity would be preparing the children for this kind of sequenced and sensorial experience with letters, right? They would be going and filling up the pitcher and putting in the basin and then really paying attention to their hands, getting their hands all clean. Maria felt like this giving children something to do, to pay attention to their hands, to really like make sure their hands were really well prepared. Of course, that had a practical reason. Children may have been outside working in the garden.
Yeah, didn't want to smooth up the.
We didn't want to like dirty up our materials.
But it is like a warm-up exercise in a way, right?
It's totally like a warm-up
Yeah.
exercise to really think about the hand, touch every single finger, make it all nice and clean. And then when your hands are clean and you're ready, you go up to Dr. Montessori and say, I'm ready for my lesson. And she says, okay, come here. And you hold out your hand. She says, give me your hand. So you hold out your hand. And she actually would use like a little feather duster or a little grouping of feathers or something. And she would brush them on the hand. You could kind of simulate that by like just kind of brushing very, very lightly. You might use something soft. You could use like your child's favorite stuffy, you know, if they have a little stuffed rabbit or something, you could just like stroke the hand very nice and slowly every little finger. And what we're doing here, she called it sensitizing the hands and the fingers. And she would actually tell the children, this is what we're doing here. So we're sensitizing your fingers, your fingertips, getting them ready for the sandpaper letters. And after they had done this little ritual of washing hands, sensitizing the fingers, then they were prepared to touch the sandpaper letters. So it was a very special and kind of magically infused lesson that she was giving them. It wasn't just like, okay, it's time for your reading lesson. As you might imagine in a classroom, let's pull out the sandpaper letters and quiz you on these. We've got a lot of flashcardy type of things going on in the field of education. And that's not what these are. They're not flashcards for children.
Like, this is, we say M, right? It looks like a flashcard, but it's not.
Looks like a flashcard, but it is actually not. So then she would have the sandpaper letter, and I'm going to hold it up. Of course, this would be laid flat. So you would take your two fingers like this. Maria Montessori actually experimented like with maybe one finger and maybe another finger, maybe using a utensil. But in classic Montessori these days, in modern times, we usually use these two fingers. And part of it is because these little fingertips you've got here, your index finger and your middle finger, are super, super, super sensitive. Maria Montessori knew this by instinct, by watching the children and observing them. She kind of had this feeling that they were super sensitive.
Well,
but
she also used science. I mean, she used the version of science that was available to her, observation and discovery. So
exactly.
Absolutely. She was able to deduce through her work and her brilliance something that we've now been able to verify with computers.
Exactly. So we actually know how many neurons are inside the fingertips. You can go look it up if you want. But there's so many that every single little ridge of your fingerprint actually has the ability to sense touch, which is incredible. Like, we tend to think of our fingers as like these pads that we sense with. But even if you were to just take, like, I know you've probably done this before, with like a little pin or something and tried to see what part of your finger is sensitive. And they have found, when they have touched just teeny parts of the finger, they have found that they are incredibly, incredibly sensitive.
And you've already gone through this. You think about with a child, you've done the hand washing, maybe with, like, I'm thinking, what if they wash with cool water and now their hands are sort of alive? And then she does this sort of awakening process. So the fingers are alive. And it's not just, touchy-feely, let's brush the hand. It's actually having an effect that we can now, look at through our, amazing science to see what's happening. And then at that point, she would say, let's take these two fingers.
And so she takes her two fingers and, so you're going to trace along. And as you trace, you're not really talking about anything. You're just tracing. You're going to say the sound that the letter makes. So I'll show you up like this. You take your fingers like this and you go, right? So you just say the sound and you just trace it, all right, with your two fingers. And you do that a few times and then let your child try, to trace it. Would you like to trace it? And that's all you're doing. You're associating sound with the shape. And that's like the very first thing you do. But
That's
you're
right.
not going to do it with all 26 letters at once.
That's
You're
right.
going to pull out the just 3 letters at a time. And they would be, some people like to choose for their very first letter, the first letter of their child's name,
Hmm.
especially if it is phonetic.
Yep.
M as in Maria.
Hmm.
But if your child is named like Jose, that starts with the J, that might be a little more confusing to hear. So it just depends on what you want to start with. You could pick your favorite letter. You could pick a vowel. You could pick a consonant. It really doesn't matter what letter you start with, but you only want to choose 3 in the beginning, so just your 3 favorites that you'd like to start with. And then you're going to do that same lesson with each one of those. You're just going to trace it and say the sound.
And again, you're not trying to teach them like a flashcard. This isn't M.
Mm-mm.
You're saying this is a shape.
It's actually not M at all. It's
Exactly. This is a shape, and
Yeah.
the shape has a sound.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you'll teach them the name of it.
Right.
But the name isn't actually the thing to start with, or actually even the important piece.
Right. So we're not holding this up saying this is the letter O. What things start with O. We're not making a big classic lesson out of it like you might see in a traditional kindergarten classroom where
like
kids
you see a movie or something, and the teacher's like, everybody say like
it's
that's
an M.
That's not how it
the
really
letter
works.
M. What's this letter, kids? It's the letter M. Like, we're not doing that. All we're doing is we're tracing it and we're saying the sound that it makes. So very, very slowly and gently, just the way you would write it. Aw. All right. So that's really how you use the sandpaper letters. There are lots of other ways that we use them. That's the initial, like kind of the introductory way. But from there, you would give a 3-period lesson. I'm sure we'll have an episode about that sometime.
For sure. Yep.
But if you don't know that yet, you're brand new to Montessori, go look up the 3-period lesson for Montessori reading. It's pretty simple. You basically restate, what it is for the child. So you would say, this is aw. This is aw. You might trace again. And then you might have your child do something with it, point to the aw. And have your child point to it. Or, I like to play silly little games. I teach these in the primary course too. Like, put the aw on your head. Go put the aw next to your brother's suitcase, and kind of play around with it. So we've got lots and lots of games that we do. We've got a game called What's Missing, where you might lay out your letters and then take one away and guess which one is missing. And it's not which one is missing. It's the letter O. No, it's aw. Aw is missing, right? So there's lots of fun games that we can play with these in the context of Montessori to help your child reinforce them and memorize the sounds of them, because that's really what we're trying to have them do. We're trying to have them memorize the sound and learn the shape. So the primary purpose of these is to have the child kind of commit the shape and the formation of the letter, the flow of it in their fingers, right? But at the same time, they're learning the sound and they're associating it with the shape of the letter, and that is going to help them with reading. So you might notice that your child wants to make the shape of these letters in other ways. They might be curious about writing utensils and spontaneously start writing them themselves. Sometimes this happens. We see it posted inside our community. Sometimes people will be like, we just started the sandpaper letters. My child is suddenly writing, wants to write them with a pencil already. Is this okay? And we try and delay, all of these more advanced things so that our children can move through their learning more slowly.
Wasn't that how? Didn't Maria have that same kind of experience?
She did. Yeah.
She herself was shocked.
She was shocked
when she saw these children drawing
the letters. Yeah, after having experience and exposure to the sandpaper letters.
She hadn't given them a direct lesson on
how to write.
She had just exposed them to them, and then snap.
Yep. Pick up that chalk and start doing it themselves on the chalkboard.
So it's an experience that we continue to have as teachers or parents when we're working with our children.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And they're fun. They're so much fun. They, once once your child has learned those first 3 letters, then you can add another letter or you can add another 3, depending on how quickly or slowly your child is working through them. I'll say that if you introduce 3 letters to your child, you do the 3-period lesson, in the way that we're describing here, you've made it as fun as you can, and your child just isn't responding to it, it's okay. There's no exact sensitive period for learning how to read.
Mhm.
This is kind of a Montessori myth that there's a sensitive period for everything and that reading is one of them, but there is actually no evidence of that.
Yeah, or that the sensitive periods are very concrete and on off.
Right.
There are sensitive periods. There's
Mhm.
periods of readiness, but it flows. And in
It
fact, we
does,
visualize
yeah.
it more like a wave.
I've known more than one parent who has introduced the sandpaper letters to their child at what they thought was the appropriate age, and then their child expressed zero interest. And then 6 months later, so they just put them all away. They were like,
Well,
"What?
you're
This
4,
didn't
so now I
work."
get to use my
Right,
sandpaper letters.
exactly. And one of them was a Montessori teacher too. So she just put the letters away for a good 6 months or so and just didn't do anything with them. And then lo and behold, her child found them in the closet 6 months later and became obsessed with them and learned all 26 letters and sounds like within a matter of days.
That's right.
So when your child is ready for it, it is very exciting and you might find yourself going through them really, really quickly. You might be amazed at the capacity for your child's ability to memorize these sounds.
Totally.
I mean, when you think about it, it really is amazing. Maybe you look at this S and it's just very clearly an S to you, but if you think about it from the perspective of a child, it's just a symbol. And how is it different from this cursive R? It is different, but the ability for a child to memorize the difference between these kind of symbols, it is amazing.
That's right.
And it is something that humans taught each other how to do, that we collectively agreed upon these systems.
Absolutely.
And there's just something really amazing that we get to give our children this gift today.
Yeah, it's one of those
Yeah.
things that we take for granted. I mean, but writing is not an innate human skill. We invented
not.
it fairly recently. When you look at all the things we've done in our as creatures on this earth, it's relatively recent. And the phonetic alphabet that we are using here in the United States is even more recent than that. So language, yes, seems to be pretty innate. Songs, all kinds of things, making sounds, like all that. But the idea of recording it using some sort of a shape, and then the progression of making the shape like a pictogram and eventually into something much, much more representative of just a sound, all was very, very recent. Again, if you think in big picture. So it is a super big gift. It's an amazing thing to do. And there's a reason why children will learn it at different paces, because it isn't a natural human thing. It's something we have to work at.
So we got to kind of wrap up here.
Yeah.
But I hope that you enjoyed this little primer on the sandpaper letters. Now, if you do not have a set of sandpaper letters at home, let's give them some quick ideas for how they
Yeah.
can either make them
Because I
or
want to
make do
emphasize that
without
it's
them.
not the sandpaper quality. It's not the shape or the color, none of that. What it's really about is the tactile.
Right.
This is about a tactile experience.
Right.
So what could you use instead of, I don't know, sandpaper?
So I have seen parents, first of all, I've seen parents DIY them in a variety of ways.
It's not hard to DIY
no.
block letters.
So you
right?
can think you could DIY it easily and make yourself a set of sandpaper letters with just glue and a little bit of sand.
Yep.
I've seen that done many, many times. So it's a very
art glue, Elmer's
simple,
glue, some kind of grittiness.
yeah,
and
some
then
kind of
draw it out.
grittiness. I also really actually love not even just using dried glue itself.
Mhm.
It's not even gritty, but it does leave a raised, it just leaves a raised surface.
Yep.
I have
Yeah,
done
I can imagine
series
doing that.
of glue dots, in the shape of a letter, and that provides an interesting texture on paper. You can also just take the glue and just do a strip, let it dry for like 2 or 3 days, and then it's just like, I don't know, it's like a little perfect little line that you could use for a letter. Other things that are fun, I have seen people use wiki sticks. Those are
Mhm.
like little wax sticks
Yep.
that you can shape to form into letters, and kind of stick to things. So you could stick it to a board
Mhm.
or stick it to a chalkboard or a cookie sheet or something, just to
Yep.
have that tactile experience. I have seen people use cloth
Mhm.
and cut letters out of cloth, like velvet or something. So
Or
it's
felt
instead
or
of
carpet
sandpaper.
even. Mm.
I've seen a lot of felt letters. I see a lot of people go to a hobby store and they find a little set of letters that are already pre-made, and they are made out of, maybe they're made out of like glittery letter material
Mhm.
or felt or something, and they'll actually use those rather than drawing and cutting out
Yeah,
their
so they
own
just paste those
sandpaper.
onto a
We just paste
surface that's
those
very
onto
different, like
something.
a
Yeah,
smooth surface.
exactly. Yeah, a piece of
Yeah.
cardboard or chipboard or something. It's pretty easy. Let me think what else. Oh, pipe cleaners. Pipe
Mhm.
cleaners make tactile letters really easily. You can just bend them into shapes and twist them and easily make a shape, especially if you were working with print.
Yep.
They make really good print letters. Although you
And,
could
and we
do
actually,
it
speaking
with
of
these
print, we
too.
actually had a great question from Lisa. She's
Hmm.
asking, is there a difficulty for children to learn cursive versus print?
Yeah. So the answer is no. Children can learn either cursive or print just fine.
Because again, it's just the shape to them.
It's just the shape to them. Yeah. So to them, an S like this and an S like this. It's just learning different formations. So
Yeah.
it's not going to be harder for them one way or another. However, it will be harder if you don't teach cursive until later. So often in schools, what we do is we teach children print first, and then when they're about in the 3rd or 4th grade,
Mhm.
then we're like, oh, hey, now you're going to learn cursive. And children are like, why? I'm comfortable with writing. I've been practicing
Yeah.
writing. This is a whole new thing for me to learn, and it
I
can
will
be
say I
confusing.
never. So when you were showing this, it's like I think, what are the letters that I know it's about, right? I consider myself educated, but I had that experience. I learned to read pretty early, and then when I
And
was
you
in the
still write in
third,
print.
and then the 3rd and 4th grade, I was taught cursive and was made to write cursive. I cannot write cursive naturally. If when I try and write cursive, it's very slow and painful. I just immediately gave it up. And all through college, grad school, everything, I always just print because, to your point, like you introduced it later. And maybe if it had been introduced earlier, it's fine. Now, of course, in the modern world with all the type that we have, maybe people say whether or not it's useful, but the bottom line is don't be scared of introducing the cursive instead of the block early
First.
on.
Yeah.
We have a misunderstanding, I think, because of our popular culture that kids find it easier to read block letters. But again, the point is like this is not a letter; it's just the shape to the child, especially, and only later will they make the symbolic relationship between shape, sound, and letter name.
Yeah.
So you can introduce the O, or you can introduce the other kind of O, or both. I think would be preferable. Right?
Well, no, I would do one and then the other. So what we usually say is in Montessori, you're going to introduce, if you want your child to learn cursive, do it first. Go ahead and introduce cursive, introduce all of the letters in cursive, but naturally you need to know that they're going to encounter print in type. When they're reading books, and they're going to notice this, and they're going to kind of have their own little epiphanies like, oh, this is the O that I know how to write, but when I read it in a book it looks like this, and their brains can do that. Our brains as adults are not quite as plastic. I mean,
Yep.
we know that there is plasticity that continues. That was a breakthrough discovery of a few years ago. I think that they learned that yes, adults also have plastic
Old
brains.
dogs can learn new tricks.
We can.
But
it takes more effort for us.
That's right.
And with little children, I mean, they just are these sponges. So I would, if you want your child to learn cursive, then I would start with it right away. And just have faith that your child will acquire print as well. Okay, They will. But if you don't care about cursive, then go ahead and teach print, and don't look back, and don't worry about the cursive. And you have my full backing on that.
So also a question here. I think some folks might be wondering, what about something like the sand tray where you're going to draw the letters? How would that lesson fit in relation to something like tracing the inverse? Like it feels like here I'm tracing the shape and I'm feeling this tactile difference, but now I have a sand tray. Am I recreating this shape? Is that the connection I would make?
So a sand tray is it's like a little tray. You put sand in it, and then your child is going to make the formation of the letter. But obviously, they don't have this letter here to form on, so they're kind of doing it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we would have them do experiences like that before they pick up a pen and try and write the O.
So it's like a bridge.
Yeah.
So they might they might start here and then try to then transfer that skill into the sand tray, drawing it,
Mm-hmm.
and then adding an additional level of difficulty where they're holding an implement and then making the shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. Well, if there are any other questions, pop them in. But I think the big thing to reiterate is that at the end of the day, what Maria discovered is that it's not the sandpaper, it's not the color, it's not the placement. All of those things are great, and the more of those elements we add in, the more clever it becomes. But at the end of the day, what we're saying is that a child who's under 6 is in a sensorial period, and we're trying to get them ready to read and write. And that the discovery here is that if you can make a sensorial connection to the child when they're in a sensorial period of development, then it makes it easier when they get to that period of abstract thought in the second plane after about the age of 6. And there's this beautiful story I'm going to read a little bit here, where she talked about, Maria herself talked about this. She wrote this in her book, The Montessori Method. She said she was talking about it after she had this great success in the school that she had worked in. And then she goes off and she wants to create more of these materials, but she couldn't find a craftsperson who could make them. It was taking too long. And so she said, quote, she decided to cut out large paper letters and to have one of the teachers color those roughly on one side with a blue tint. As for the touching of the letters, I thought of cutting the letters of the alphabet out of sandpaper and gluing them upon smooth cards, thus making objects much like those used in the primitive exercises for the tactile senses.
Mm-hmm.
Only after I had made these simple things that I become aware of the superiority of this alphabet to that magnificent one I had used for my original students.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, her conclusion was, we wish the old things because we cannot understand the new. And we're always seeking after that gorgeousness which belongs to things already in the decline, without recognizing in the humble simplicity of new ideas the germ which shall develop in the future. In other words, there was something magic in that original experiment and the beauty of those materials. But when she stripped it down and really thought about it, she got the new idea, the germ, which that simplicity, the humble simplicity of the new idea. In this case, the tactile experience. And that was the discovery. So if you're out there and you're like, I can't make a cursive O, I don't know how to do that, don't feel limited by it. Find some materials. There's lots in the craft stores you can use.
Yeah, or
pick a sponge up.
You go to Target and you can look and find a little set of flashcards and then make those into a sandpaper letter
cut out
experience.
The card, or use that as a stencil to cut out sandpaper. Be experimental. Don't feel limited because you don't have this like proper, I don't know, manufactured thing. Even Maria herself had that aha moment. The thing she wanted to make was not as good as the thing she wound up having to make out of necessity, and then realizing that simpler product of necessity actually was right because it spoke to the humble simplicity of the real idea. So great life lesson there, and a great lesson about how we can be homeschool Montessorians. I love that little anecdote.
All right. Thank you so much, friends, for joining us. You can find the sandpaper letters on the essential Montessori materials list on our website at childoftheredwoods.com.
That's right. You can also reach us by email at hello@childoftheredwoods.com. You can leave a comment on this. If you like the show, please give us a thumbs up if that is your desire. We'd love to hear from you as well. If you have a comment, share your thoughts. If you like to listen instead of watch, you can get this as a podcast. Go to our website for that. Otherwise, we'll see you next week at 1 p.m. Pacific.
Yep, that's right. All right. Thank you all. See you next time.